One of the things I've done a lot of since we've been hunkering down due to the pandemic is I've done a lot of work in my garden. I always loved the garden, but this year I did more in it than I've ever done before. I began by putting all kinds of new soil all the way around, and then did all kinds of planting, and every week I weeded and I pruned my bushes. But somehow or another, I don't think I ended up with a curious garden. Most people say my gardens are looking pretty good, but it's not a curious garden. We're going to have to read this together and find out what makes a garden curious. It's by Peter Brown. There once was a city without gardens or trees or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their time indoors. As you can imagine, it was a very dreary place. And look at the colors, all grays and browns, and a little bit of white, but nothing that comes close to being green or red. However, there was one boy who loved being outside, even on drizzly days, while everyone else stayed inside. You could always find Liam happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was on one such morning that Liam made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Liam had always wanted to explore the tracks, there was only one thing for this curious boy to do. Liam ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wildflowers and plants were the last things he had expected to find up. Look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. See the plants? See the orange and the red by the tracks. They're obviously wildflowers, but they needed tending. They needed to be looked after. Liam may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited while Liam found better ways of gardening. As the weeks rolled by, Liam began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like a real garden. Most gardens stay in one place, but this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up farther and farther down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. Over the next few months, Liam and the curious garden explored every corner of the railway. You know, there's more than one different way for plants to travel, and start to grow in new places, you'll have to think about that one. Look at all the daisies. My garden has daisies all over the place, because daisies grow easily and their seeds fly easily. Now you see some color. Those beautiful wildflowers are spreading. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Liam's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season, and for the first time since he'd become a gardener, Liam could not visit the plants. Rather than waste his winter worrying about the gardener, Liam spent it preparing for spring. After 3 cold months, the snow finally began to melt, and Liam rolled his new gardening gear over to the railway. That's a wheelbarrow. It's called a wheelbarrow that Liam is pushing with his tools. Winter had taken a toll on the garden, but thanks to Liam's planning, his handy new tools, and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from their winter sleep. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up further and further from the railway and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. But the most surprising things that popped up were the new gardeners. All different kinds of people were interested in growing green things, just like Liam. Look at all the beautiful things the new gardeners were doing with the plants. That's the beauty of gardens. You can make them look any way you want. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed, but of all the new gardens, Liam's favorite was where it all began. Now there's no more just gray and brown. Look at the orange and the green and the white. The Curious Garden. Gardening is something that you can really enjoy because you get to see what happens when you look after the plants. Plants that are looked after grow. And they grow and they grow and they grow. And then we feel good because we've made something nice happen. Gardening is good for you. You better make plans to garden in the springtime next year. Night now.